Okay, well, welcome everyone. I hope you enjoyed the conference. My name is Grant Osterman. I'll be the room coordinator today. And this session will be video recorded. So if you're not comfortable with your video on, please turn off your videos and change your name if you feel that's a necessity. Our speaker today is Brandon Garland, and he's talking about Gairaigo, Japanese EFL learners' hidden vocabulary. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Grant. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'd like to start my presentation today with a list of words. Social distance, cluster, lockdown, remote work, pandemic. So these are words, of course, we've been learning a lot about recently, more than we would have liked to. But I think the interesting thing to note about these words is they're not just words that native speakers of English have been learning a lot about. They're also words that Japanese have been learning about in this form, the katakana transliterations of the words, which are read as social distance, kurasta, lockdown, remote work, and pandemic. Of course, these are some of the most extreme examples, but every month, every week even, new English words are coming into Japanese. So I first started to notice this as a student of Japanese myself. One of the things I try to do to improve my Japanese is watch television. And I kept noticing there were all these words that I could easily understand. So this comes as a real boon to communication, the realization that a great number of English words with minor alterations can be understood in Japanese. But then I started to think about these words in my role as an English teacher, and I wondered, well, if these words can help me so much in my Japanese communication, could the same thing be true for my students in their English communication? And so the idea for this project was born. First, though, a little background, a history on the subject. So the first written form of Japanese was imported from China in the form of kanji, the Chinese logographic system, of which this is an example right here. This actually says kanji. And from kanji were derived the syllabaries, the Japanese syllabaries of hiragana and katakana. Hiragana came to be used mostly with Japanese words, and katakana with words of foreign origin known as Gairaigo, of which this is the kanji right here. Literally means words coming from outside. So Gairaigo come from many different languages. There's Gairaigo in French and Portuguese and Dutch, many other cultures that have come into contact with Japan. Though in modern times, Gairaigo comes primarily from English. A 1964 survey by the Japanese Language Research Institute found that 10% of words in everyday Japanese are Gairaigo origin, with 90% of these coming from English. As far as the portion of Gairaigo in Japanese, a survey of dictionary word distributions found that in 1891, Gairaigo accounted for 551 terms, or 1.4% of the overall contents, whereas nearly 100 years later, that number had increased to 13,300 terms, or nearly 10% of the overall content. This is an amazing increase, particularly when we consider the vast linguistic divide between Japanese and European languages, such as English. All this led Japanese loanword researcher Frank Dalton to declare that the principal engine of word generation in contemporary Japanese is borrowing from English. Today's Japanese are living in the generation of Gairaigo, witnessing a revolution of words. So given the ubiquity of English in Gairaigo and the intense focus on English education in Japan, we can safely assume the English-Gairaigo connection is utilized by teachers in Japan, right? The answer is no, actually. Not only is Gairaigo not used in classrooms, it's often actively discouraged. According to Dalton, a number of studies have focused on perceived interference in pronunciation and word meaning. The problem with a lot of these studies, however, is they're largely anecdotal. It's not just studies, however, entire books have been written on the subject with titles like That Katakana English Foreigners Don't Understand and Japanese English Full of Problems. So there'd seem to be a pervasive attitude in Japan that Gairaigo can only hurt, not help English communication. So to be sure, you can't transition seamlessly from Gairaigo into English. But the problem with over-focusing on mistakes is that it covers up potential benefits. And according to research into cognates and second language acquisition, there clearly is a benefit for learners of second languages, including learners of Japanese. Keeping all of this in mind, I designed this pilot research project as a way to address this potential shortcoming in Japanese EFL instruction. I created a week-long course to promote Gairaigo awareness and facility in my students. I did pre and post tests to determine what effect the course had on their vocabulary abilities, and I gave an in-class survey to determine students' interest in the subject. My research for questions for the project were as follows. Firstly, what effect does studying Gairaigo have upon students' vocabulary comprehension, particularly in relation to English-based Gairaigo words? And secondly, are students interested in the subject of Gairaigo, and do they feel motivated to study it? Methodology for this project. So first of all, the participants were all first-year English class of 16 economic majors at a Japanese university. They were of about lower intermediate English ability, basically a CEF level from A1 to B1. Class met 4 times over the course of a week, each time for 45 minutes, and 13 of the students took part in the survey after the course. The survey itself was a Likert scale survey of 5 questions in English with Japanese translations that was given to gauge students' interest in the subject of Gairaigo and how useful they felt its study could be to their English. And the tests, as I said, there was a pre-test given in the course immediately before the Gairaigo course and a post-test in the class immediately after. The test was composed of 3 sections, a first section dealing with questions about shortened and back-clipped Gairaigo. And I'll get into a little later about the meanings of some of these terms. Section 2 had questions to test students' ability to form new form new words based on Gairaigo headwords. And section 3 questions on the recognition of semantic change and false cognates. A little more detail about the test. So sections 1 and 2 of the test were graded using a simple incorrect, correct rubric with correct answers getting a score of 1, incorrect answers a score of 0. Section 3 of the test, however, had a sliding scale applied, and this was done to determine whether students showed any progress in their comprehension of false cognates. So for example, a question on the test was this here on the right. They received the word front and 3 potential definitions. If the students chose the false cognate definition, a hotel reception, Gairaigo furanto actually refers to a hotel reception, they received a score of 1. If they chose a more neutral definition, like to move up, they received a score of 2. And if they chose the correct definition, they received a score of 3. So many items on the test were taken from the first 1,000 of the list of common loan words corresponding to the British National Corpus found in the appendix of Dalton's book. An exception to this were the semantically shifted Gairaigo, which due to their rather limited and idiosyncratic nature couldn't be correlated with any existing vocabulary lists. A little more detail about the Gairaigo course. So as I mentioned, it was 4 45-minute lessons, the goals of which were to raise students' awareness of Gairaigo, to teach them common errors associated with moving between Gairaigo and English, and to encourage their interest in the subject of Gairaigo. A framework for the course was provided by Dalton's book, Japan's Built-in Lexicon of English-Based Loanwords, including the idea to teach common mistakes moving between Gairaigo and English, and also using Gairaigo root words to expand vocabulary. In more detail, on day 1 of the course, in addition to, of course, introducing it to the students, and I also provided them with a short workbook, we covered the subject of shortening. And this is the Japanese tendency to abbreviate many Gairaigo words to their shortest comprehensible form. An example would be the English personal computer is actually said as pasokon in Gairaigo. So after some explanation, I had students do a worksheet, of which I have an example right here. So as you can see, I asked the students to circle all the mini Gairaigo. This is a term I came up with to replace shortened or back-clipped. I tried to simplify linguistic terminology for the students. So they're supposed to circle the words and then write in the entire English equivalent. So as a student, for example, I might have circled the word basket and then written in the word basketball. After this, we did some speaking practice and students were given homework for that day. On day 2, we covered the topic of semantic change and shift. This is the ways in which English words can change their meaning when they come into Gairaigo. According to Dalton, English words inevitably acquire meanings cultural specific to Japan, which is only natural, of course, as Japan has its own culture and native words to choose from. A couple examples of semantic change and shift. So the word ice or ice in Gairaigo actually does not refer to frozen water, but is used to talk about ice cream. The word mail is nothing that comes through the post, but is only used for email. And the rather peculiar baby car is not a tiny automobile for infants, but is actually used to refer to strollers. On day 2, we also covered the related concept of grammatical transformation, which is the tendency of Gairaigo to shorten, English words, Gairaigo words rather, to their shortest comprehensible form, to add an S to words like shoe, for example, regardless of whether it is a singular or plural subject. So in order to introduce the subject to my students, I created a PowerPoint for them, which I have an example of right here. So starting off with the word ice or ice, I asked my students to imagine what image pops into your mind when you hear this word ice. Then I showed them this picture right here and I asked, well, show of hands, how many people thought of something like this right here? At this point, a lot of students did raise their hand. And then I explained to them that in English, this is not ice, actually. This is. This was met by some surprise by my students. We did a few more examples, and gradually they were able to get the concept of semantic change and shift. After which we did some more speaking practice, some more worksheets, and once again assigned homework for that day. Day 3 of the course, we covered using Gairaigo headwords to expand English vocabulary through the use of affixes. So we started out with some homework examples that students had brought in of Gairaigo, and then we talked about how we can expand from those words as a base. Once again, students did some worksheets on this, and at the end, we finished with the kind of categories style game in which students competed in teams to see which team could make the most words based on a Gairaigo root word. Day 4, the final day of the course, we did a review of what we'd done in the previous 3 days. We started off by sharing some answers to a homework question, which I gave students, which was, do you often use Gairaigo? Why or why not? And what is your favorite Gairaigo word? And a sample response was, yes, I do, because it's natural for me and easy to use. I like domai. We then reviewed the course and ended with some review games. And I thank the students for their participation. Turning to results. So on the pre-Gairaigo course test, students scored a mean of 6.9 out of a possible 10 on the first section, dealing with shortened Gairaigo. On section 2, Gairaigo headwords, it was 7 out of 10. And on section 3, semantic change and false cognates, it was 16 out of 30 for a total score of 29.9 out of 50. On the post-Gairaigo course test, students scored a 6.7 on section 1 out of 10, a 5.8 out of 10 on 2, and a 21.9 out of a possible 30 on the final section for a total of, sorry, I can't see the bottom of my screen right here, but it's 31.4, something like that, which indicates a statistically significant result, sufficient evidence for us to reject the null hypothesis of this experiment, in this case being that test scores would show no change after the intervention of the Gairaigo course. Looking at the test results in a little more detail, we can see that actually a large part of the increase in student scores was due to their results on the third section of the test, the section dealing with semantic change and false cognates, where they went from a total of 16 out of 30 to 21.9 out of 30, a nearly 6-point increase. On the other hand, students' scores on the first 2 sections of the test actually decreased slightly, going from 6.9 to 6.7 and 7 to 5.8 respectively. Turning to the survey, So it was 5 statements which students were asked to indicate their level of agreement with. And looking at the results, we can see that students overall had a positive response to the course. Statement 1, I enjoy learning about JALT, received 9 out of 13 responses, either strongly agreeing or agreeing with. So they seem to enjoy the course. Statement 2, learning about JALT helps me improve my English, got actually the most enthusiastic response. 6 out of the 13 respondents indicated strong agreement with that statement. So there seemed to be a kind of good for me effect at play here, whereby students, regardless of whether how excited they were about the course, nevertheless felt it was good for their English communication. Statement 3, the worksheets and PowerPoints on JALT were helpful and enjoyable. Received some of the most positive responses. 10 out of the 13 either strongly agreed or agreed with that statement. Statement 4, learning about JALT is not interesting, was basically an inverted version of statement 1, inserted to check validity, and it did correlate with that. And statement 5, I would like to learn more about JALT, also received more than 50% positive responses. Turning to a discussion of these results. So first research question again was, what effect does studying JALT have upon students' vocabulary comprehension, particularly in relation to English-based JALT words? Looking at the results of the test, we can say that the study of English-based JALT has a significant effect on students' vocabulary abilities. It was interesting to note in particular the rapid increase in the recognition of false cognates and semantic shift, which could show us a relatively quick way to boost our students' vocabularies. On the other hand, the slight decrease in the first 2 sections of the test dealing with dealing with shortened words and head words could indicate that these skills take longer to require and therefore would be better suited to a longer course. As to the second research question, are students interested in the subject of JALT? Do they feel motivated to study it? The results of the survey indicate a strong yes to both of these questions. Students seem to feel particularly strongly that the study of English-based JALT benefited their English, and many students also expressed interest in continued study of the subject beyond the confines of a week-long course, which could bode well for further inclusion of JALT in classes. Finally, turning to limitations of the project. So as an exploratory study, this project was limited in both size to 16 participants and 13 survey respondents, and scope, just a week-long course. Also, all participants were taken from the same major at the same institution, and it is possible that students from a different major or from a different institution could produce different results. Lastly, this project did not cover the rather tricky issue of speaking and pronunciation, though as these constitute a major focus of contemporary Japanese EFL instruction, they could represent a promising avenue for further JALT research in the future. Despite these limitations, I believe both this research and current trends in Japanese society show that JALT is a subject highly worthy of our attention. It could provide tremendous benefits to our students in the classroom, both now and in the years to come. Thank you very much for listening. So I'll just briefly scroll through my references here. I always want to give credit where credit's due. And then if we have time for questions, we can do that.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Yes.
Yeah, no problem.
How we will handle questions is if you want to unmute yourself, we're in a small room. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask our speaker any question you might have.
Hi, I was just wondering if you have the materials, are they available somewhere?
I do have the materials. If you'd like to send me your information, I can forward them to you.
Yeah, actually,
I don't have them posted up right now on a site or anything like that, but if you'd like to.
What was your email again? I'm sure it was probably in your presentation, but
let me
you can
just
type it in the chat. It's easier.
put it into chat, maybe.
Because I find, yeah, students definitely struggle with some of the foreign words that are not quite what they think they are.
And Brendan, if you could put in, if you're willing to put in your slides, someone was asking, William was asking if you could put your slides in there.
Oh yeah, no problem as well. let's see, have that as a file maybe. Google Drive.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? We still have.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the slides to send, but yeah, if
About
somebody
5
does have a
minutes.
question.
So, sorry, I came in late. Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
I'd just like to know, maybe you covered this because I missed the first part, but how do you handle situations where there are words that are sort of made in Japan English words, like words that sound English, but they're not used by English speakers? And English speakers will probably not understand them when our students use those
I
words.
think you'd call it like wasego or.
Yeah, exactly. Wasego. Like, I'm just thinking my students always say S&S, and I think we're so used to that being used in Japan that we don't even realize it's not really English. But if you say it to England, if you go to England and you say, oh, I posted this on S&S, nobody will understand what you're talking about, right?
Lots of things like that, yeah. And again, I recommend the book that I read, Japan's Built-in Lexicon by Dalton. It does actually cover that. I felt like it was somewhat covered in the day we did semantic change and shift. They kind of got the idea of some of these things. I believe, I didn't actually mention it in my presentation, but I believe we did cover a little bit of what that's called wasego, kind of not really English, but some Japanese people think that it's English. But yeah, that would be a good idea for, I think, expansion, definitely. Again, because that seemed to be one of the areas that students improved most in, was kind of recognizing when words change, or possibly, as you mentioned, when words actually aren't even English at all.
Okay, thank you. You said that's a book that deals with that topic.
Yeah, it's in my references there. I mentioned it as well, but it's, if you'd like, I could show my references one more time.
Or if you could just type the title in the chat, maybe.
Sure, I'll do that.
Copy paste.
Easier. Japan's built-in lexicon of English-based loanwords, and that's by a man named Frank Dalton.
That sounds like an interesting read.
There you go. And again, I apologize. I had some problems getting the files to share, but I did put my email there. If anybody cares to, please do feel free to contact me, and I can send it on to you, as well as any other materials or questions that you might have.
Brendan, I have a question.
Sure.
Is there a way to know when a word is officially a Gairaigo? Because it seems like there's a lot of words that people use but don't understand, or like they say them to, I mean, there are people that use Gairaigo just to impress other people, and other people don't even understand what they're saying. And so there's these like words in the middle, and as words are like going through that shift of from being foreign to being understood, is there anything in particular that you can do with those kind of words? Whereas words like pasokong, everybody understands that, but can't think of any of words. But often, like in a textbook, the list, the vocabulary words, I wonder, like in new words in a reading, maybe they know this word already, or I mean, they heard it so many times in high school. Even if it's not Gairaigo, they probably understand it. But and if they probably understand it, does that make it Gairaigo?
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating the way that these words kind of morph and change. Some of the, for example, words from, I mentioned already that some of the Gairaigo come from other languages. Some of them still in regular use, like saying pan, for example, for bread, actually from Portuguese. Although some of those actually tend to die out over time and then get replaced with English-Gairaigo. So, I mean, as everybody knows here, language is definitely an organic thing. It's constantly changing. But yeah, again, I just highly recommend. I'm not the expert in it. I stand on the shoulders of others, and the book that Frank Dalton wrote does cover a lot of that kind of evolution of Gairaigo words. I was just trying to cover kind of basically a lot of the simpler stuff for my students, but I think definitely it's something that could be expanded on. Thanks for the question.
And thank you, Brendan. That's the end of our time today. If you unmuted yourself, if we can give our presenter a nice warm round of applause, please.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you.